Record. Okay, so yeah, we're recording now. So yeah, Martin, thanks for sending over the chart this morning for the climate SIG. And I guess maybe we should talk about that first. So I think that might be a good point to start off. And then I
Okay.
want, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't, if there's points that can segue from last time, we could also start with that. But to me, this was a bit of a segue from last time. A couple of weeks ago, I ran through a lot of the documentation that was on the wiki working group. And then our catch-up session with you, Sai, really helped me understand a bit of what you guys have been discussing, since I think I missed the first couple of the sessions of peer programming. And you know, we from the Yale Open Lab and the Open Foundation, we've been doing a lot of work on essentially two verticals. One's climate accounting, and whereas MRV becomes a very important part of it. And the other one is solar financing. And in fact, on the weekend or a weekend ago, we were discussing with Matt, who joined us today, on some of the joint work that we've also been doing around a project called Open Solar, that I'm happy to give a walkthrough what it entails. But the underlying conversation was around, you know, applications that they've been working on, and probably describe a little bit more of that, are a part within a business process flow. And normally that process flow is identifying a project, doing the feasibility of financing a solar project, doing all the documentation, raising the funds for the project, building the project, and then operating it. But this is from the lens of securitization of the project. So the amount of regulation that goes into the project actually having to be a company that issues equity or debt instruments is pretty sophisticated. And so there's a lot of things that are involved in the process, and we've been trying to find ways of making it more seamless and be built on top of an open source process. And so I put a little bit of two and two together, and I thought that some of the fundamental paradigm that, Sai, you've been discussing with the peer programming group fit very well with this, and it also aligned with some of the work that we've been doing, exploring the use of Hyperledger, Indy, and Aries as agents in a network with trusted interactions. And so I put that kind of as just to create a bit of a mind map, and I don't know to what extent the systems engineering of it or the software engineering aspect of how I described it is correct. I was hoping that perhaps this is something that we can check, and to see if this is indeed close to what everyone's been discussing, and an opportunity for us to work together. Second, there's a lot that we can bring in to put an example to it. So I send a generic version, but that could be grounded into a specific use case. And the interesting thing there, particularly looking at USI, is that the work that you've been doing at SEAS and Utility API is also a very important instrument within that pipeline, because your example is, I need to see a site and I need to look at the meters, and I need to be able to extract some information from the power meters. And in the case of the Open Solar project, what we've been working on is, can we take the data from a power meter, let's say the inverter of a solar project, and automate payments, and automate renewable energy certificates, and automate ownership change as you're making payments. There's the opportunity of grounding a common generic architecture into a specific solar use case, but I think in many other climate action financing use cases. And then I think an underlying opportunity, as also Alfonso pointed out, is I think 2 weeks from now, we start November 9th, the Collabothon, and we have a specific session earmarked for this working group to be able to share what we've been doing, and invite, let's say, recruit developers that are interested in helping collaborate. So we can start thinking about how to frame this properly in a prompt.
Okay.
That's the overall introduction. Um, I'm happy to share my screen. I basically posted that diagram into the climate development system, which is the Google slide that I put into um, the wiki. I'm posting it, the link directly here. I'm going to pause there to see if there's any questions, thoughts, or comments. And I'm happy to share my screen and just to walk through it and then see if that sparks ideas.
Yeah, I think that sounds great. I don't see any questions, so we should do that.
Great. So there's much that I can, before talking about open solar, if we need to go in detail, which we can if needed. What I tried to describe here, or what I sent, is thinking about starting from the bottom up, these business process flows. And again, this is very generic, but we often find that there is different applications that provide services across process flows. You could almost look at this also from a point of view of supply chain, but I think it made more sense to frame it as business processes, and we can see the next slide that I give a concrete example. But so the first part is, okay, what's the common open source network layer? What do we pack inside that? And the applications basically are interoperating within that layer. So in some sense, this bottom aspect can be seen as facilitating a consortium, because these applications could be different companies. And this just shows that in some process flows, and I'm keeping it very generic, you could have almost like an application for every process. But sometimes you have a very kind of vertically integrated application that runs through many different processes. And so that's also kind of the logic there. And this, in some sense is a bit inspired by, I'm going to go back to the notes that we had from the conversation with you guys, I think a couple of weeks ago, which is the use of a ledger to have a common data sharing infrastructure so that the applications or solution applications are able to utilize that, and they don't have to build APIs between them. And that there's ledger integration apps also using public ledger, or I think private ledger in the case of Fabric. This was a very specific case that you've been working on, Sai, on meter billing, utility API. And I asked the question, how much of this has already been built, and what's next? And I added this to the left just to put it out into the discussion. I'm actually having a meeting with Stephen Karan from Hyperledger Aries to discuss this a little bit more detail, to see if he agrees that Hyperledger India and Aries could be a great addition to allow this interoperability to happen, but second, if they want to join the working group. And then this was just a proxy and for us to see if this was correct, that I kind of described that I understood that this is a part that you were working on, Sai, that Robin, I think that your approach on getting a Fabric integration kind of fits around this. And Connor, I think you have a bit more of the ambitious task of thinking about a common client, and exactly what that entails. I'd love to hear more about it, particularly on your Web3 application. What I think we did, I think we discussed this last time, of just trying to understand how OpenTAPS was structured and how that can extract emission tracking data, both for supply chain tracking or organization footprint, and that this is relevant for consumer disclosure, because what I think we were wanting to do here is, we have 3 working groups in the SIG, and if we think about a collaborathon and putting it out there to the broader community, if we find a prompt that helps weave in the 3 working groups together, I think this is going to be more exciting, because the consumer disclosure working group, they haven't been doing a lot of code, but they've been putting a lot of thoughtware into the logics of it. And I think that for anything related to consumer disclosure, this data coming in from supply chains is relevant. And then fusing carbon offsets, which is where Alfonso's monitoring, reporting, and verification comes in, of a certified action matched with certified emissions. It's the contract that fuses both of these that allows a carbon neutral certification, right? So in some sense, this was just a very quick and dirty diagram to see if we can have a narrative to weave the different working groups of the SIG. Now, independent to this, or let's say not independent to it, but as we're thinking through that narrative, this is very much what we discussed before, the role of the distributed ledger as a common data layer and a client. And I don't know, I describe it as a software development kit, as something that makes the application have an easier time integrating with the network, rather than having to, this application API to this one, to this one, to this one, and then vice versa. But then, thinking in terms of these buckets of process flows and the role of business protocols and taxonomy. So the next slide, well, before going into that, just one last comment is some of these applications are open source, but a lot of these applications may not be open source. And so this is when we really think about, how this is useful for all kinds of businesses. We have to come up with a mechanism that allows non-open source apps to interoperate on this. So that a big part of that is because of the business model that these applications have. And the open source incentive mechanisms for these applications and companies to work on a common layer is also something worth exploring. So this is just part of what we took that, and we had a first discussion with Matt on Raise Green, because their process, they can explain a little bit more about what they do, but they operate a FINRA regulated portal. I'll just put a face to a name, just feel free to chime in, Matt, but just to keep the, they're a FINRA operated portal where you can invest on solar energy at the community level. So highly regulated, but the logic of this is people identify a project, they originate it, and Race Green has built a software called the Originator Engine that helps you run through all the stages of a solar project, and then outputs all the PDF documents to issue securities, raise those securities through crowd investment, build the project, and then run it. So here are just some examples of the application ecosystem. And there's a lot more, and there's more to map, and they kind of all fit within different parts of it. For example, Aurora is a very famous solar app that helps you calculate exactly how much a solar project is going to produce, how much it's going to cost, etc. You need that as a pre-feasibility. The Originator Engine will help you say, okay, this is an investable project, and here's all the documentations. Raise Green uses a software as a service in the back end. Blue Banyan is another existing application that helps you manage a solar construction project. And a lot of the focus that we did in Open Solar is on automating, and I'll show just one diagram. There's a lot of documentation here, and I'm happy to circulate this as well. Actually, one of the slides that I want to show is not here, but this is the hub of the Open Solar project that's a Yale and MIT partnership, which is a solar project can bring in payments from investors, contractors. Basically, investors invest in a project, the project disperses the funds to contractors, they install the infrastructure, and then the IoT data coming out of the power meter triggers the payments of the off-taker, let's say the recipient, and pays back to the project, which also has a cap table that makes the settlements of payments back to investors. And then there's a role for insurers and guarantors. So this is a current smart contract that we have. You could check out the Yale Open Lab GitHub where that's hosted, and particularly OpenX, which is the underlying mechanism. But anyways, that's just one example, and it uses Stellar to deal with all the payments. And so we could probably think about different business process flows like this one within the climate space. So I just wanted to put it out there. I think that was just the last line, as to see if I'm close to what was described before between the efforts, and if this is something worthy of us, joining efforts and saying this is something that the SIG and the different working groups can work together on, and that what everyone individually, also with the organizations and with your efforts, actually fits into this. I'd love to hear if, and I put the client here just because this was a bit of this common layer, to see if this is remotely close to what you have in mind, and see if that sparks good discussion, and what do we think would be a good way forward. For my end, I definitely want to bring in Stephen Curran for Hyperledger Indian Aries to the conversation, which is in some sense the trust over IP stack, which is a very also good Linux consortium that would be great for this to be relevant to, right? I'll stop there.
Wow. Does anybody else have any comments?
So, Martin, would you be able to reopen it just so I can talk as as you've got it on screen?
Yes, sure.
Just to provide, it was only a couple of small things, but it might help with the clarity. But it's I think to echo Sai's point there as well. It's it's great what you have here. I think that with on where you have like the app 0B and app 1B and then app 2 and 4, and it's like you've got the environment 1 sort of right below it. It might be it might add a little bit more clarity just to have some sort of box around the things that encompass other apps, if you see what I mean. So as in, we know that apps 2, 3 and 4 come underneath app 2 to 4, but I think visually it's slightly easier if you maybe have some way to divide them, just so that someone can kind of see their group together into one component.
Actually,
and then
thank you. That is a great point, because what I actually meant to describe here is, see, when you have to run a business process flow, like the one that I described here, you can do it with these set of apps, or you could do it with these set of apps, because there's a lot of competing apps out there in the market. So what I meant to say is, this is one configuration, but you could run it with these set of apps, and they might be different one. In fact, particularly when we look at the financing aspect, we find applications that solve certain parts, particularly on raising funds, that are very regulation specific. So if you want to apply the same business process flow somewhere else in the world, you can't use that app, and so you have to bring another app in the same structure. So that's essentially what I meant by that. But I think what you described is each app might have other service apps. So for example, this application might be pulling in microservices from other apps that said that this one interacts with. But basically, this app ensures that process flow 2, 3, and 4 are covered through the user experience of this app. In fact, in some sense, if we do this well, this is almost like an integrated user experience, but creating interoperability between the apps. You would
and certainly when it's like this, I think it is quite clear. I think it was just that how it was presented initially, I thought that I didn't realize that it was like those were kind of two options that you were showing.
Okay, thank you.
We think of it almost like a slot machine, right? Where it's like, you can have multiple apps, but they're connected by one flow, because there's a degree of substitutability. Some softwares will work in multiple countries, some won't, etc. So the question is, you have one string, which is the US version, that can have a few different permutations for different phases. For example, in 3 or 4 may use different apps in the US, but 0, 1, 2 may be the same. So that's kind of like the different slot machine configurations. And the question is, how can you make the interoperability between the applications? And that's kind of something that we're thinking a lot about. And I'd love to get an understanding as well. I don't know if it would be useful, but I could briefly show the architecture of our current stack and how we're thinking about like which would be the best part to plug into the client as an application, for example, because we're already, if you go to slide 8, Martine, like looking at, we're already APIing into North Capital. We're examining APIs between Aurora. They don't want an API, right? Because for them, they have to API individually to a variety of companies. And when they do that, then the companies will just display their results on their website, And so what's the incentive to get, Aurora or a different company to participate directly in an API as opposed to, for example, some sort of client protocol like the equivalent being like SMTP for email, right? Like what is the equivalent to Exchange? What protocol would be equivalent to Exchange Solar data with in a server agnostic format, which that's why I'd love to get a little bit of detail from the client, and I could also briefly show our stack if it would be useful.
Yeah, we could do that later on, but I think it's worth kind of talking a bit about whether this is logic. If there's something missing, what do you envision? Working here, Connor, and just the last point to your comment is that actually allows a competitive market of apps. So it's kind of a bit of an app store. If you, just to give an example, if at any point in time to do a monitor reporting verification assessment of something, you have to create a digital twin. Well, you can have the Microsoft app and set of stack, or you could have the AWS one. And being able to provide a common infrastructure, it actually can be very beneficial for the ecosystem because it's that competitive. This can bring in more actors working on that common layer.
This brings up an interesting question. I mean, how easy would it be to have an SDK that could connect to several different ledgers, like several different Fabric ledgers, an Ethereum ledger, or some other, so that all the different channels of data and all the different types of data could be connected to through one client? Or will we end up having, a whole mix of different clients, each connecting to their own ledgers, and you just sort of pick and choose which ones you want? What do you guys think here?
When we say clients, just for clarity, like I'm confused what you mean by client. I mean, are you talking about like that's where I would API, or just like an application? Could you just one sentence on what that actually looks like?
Yeah, it would be an API for you to access the data on the ledger. For example, an API for accessing the data of utility meter data that's stored on the ledger.
And that API is actually the actual Hyperledger that is distributed amongst thousands.
I think here would be a common API that one has to create for this environment. And I guess one thought that I had about what you just mentioned, Sai, is, we discussed around like different clients or client that can integrate with different ledgers. Mm-hmm. I think that in this model, the way I thought as a first approach is just having a common ledger, because it's just tied to a specific process flow, that you almost have a consortium that it's fine if it's a permission ledger, because these are all applications that need trust around.
Okay, I see. Process flows. So you're thinking, for example, a ledger for solar.
Exactly.
Exactly. And then that's like distinct from a ledger for like motor vehicles. And
what I wanted to point out that I didn't mention, and you understand the site, is often when you have to bring in together applications on a common business process flow, the hardest part is having a common standard and taxonomy.
Yes.
In a supply chain, like if everyone's speaking something different, it becomes really hard. But the solar world has this amazing standard and taxonomy that's now very mature, and so we don't have to worry about it. That's why I think it's a good use case. And I think that, so you mentioned that you were using Origin Button for utility API or for Cs. If we go into, let's say, a climate monitor reporting verification process, we don't have this. We kind of have to start with this. Whereas this is an advantage of thinking how to do an MVP or a proof of concept using the solar world, because we already inherit the standards. I can show what this looks like, because there's very good documentation on this. you can bring in, like an instrument in this process flow is a power purchase agreement. So if you look for a power purchase agreement, here's already the schemas and the contract elements and all the common taxonomies for it. So this makes very, very easy to think about business interoperability because we've already, someone already sorted that piece out.
Yeah, and just as a note, I've actually been participating on the technical working group of the Orange Button taxonomy for like the last year. So like, as soon as, if that's of interest, we can kind of connect these two efforts and attempt some sort of use case of an integration of Hyperledger into this schema. They're using Open API framework. I don't know how easily that integrates into the current, structure of Hyperledger Indy or Aries, but that could be a very interesting project for the Collabothon. Would be combining, trying to basically use this protocol on that, existing kind of client API.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Okay. That's really interesting. So this would be like a good use case maybe to talk about at the Collabothon, right? In terms of the solar finance and even like how to, integrate the pieces together. And
it would be just one use case that there's a lot of apps that we already can bring into the table to test, and we have a lot of willing developers within that space, and also one that has already a defined standard and taxonomy.
Right. Okay.
Just going to say, just on Matt's point there as well, with the token integration that we've got, that's Open API based, so there's kind of some synergies there as well.
Okay.
I'd like to ask something. Bear with me. I'm new in the group. What I understand that you're saying, Martin and Sai, is to have one accounting system, which could have or could not have several interconnected ledgers. And it just reminded me of the issue with a bank clearinghouse. So is that what you're talking about?
Well, I think that from the point of view of like a common accounting system, that's a one step broader. What we're trying to propose to ground a common work that we could do is it's focusing on the interoperability of applications, because if you have different applications working on climate accounting, it's very important for them to and climate accounting has a process. So if you build a project, just to describe this, once you build the project and it's running, while it's running, it's producing renewable energy certificates or carbon offsets. If it's, for example, a clean energy project. Now that itself is an entire process flow that kind of cuts through it, right? And it would almost be like a separate process that spins out of that. So this is almost like a step before, just to see, when you have an ecosystem of multiple applications within a business process flow, can they have a common data layer? I think the way that Sai described it in our wiki is very elegant from the point of view of the pain point. Exactly this, let me see. Yeah, the multi-channel data architecture, but it's probably one step forward, not just common data. So like the issue of having, to rely on every app having an API with themselves and having a common layer. That's a bit of the logic here.
Okay, thank you.
Connor, I think you were going to say something.
So just on the Open API piece, but one other question I did just have, and this is probably just where you've got Stella mentioned on, I think, is it slide 8 in one of the examples?
Yes.
So Stella is like a blockchain-based payments platform, and so why would Stella be up there rather than down below? Or is it more that Stella fits into one of those categories in terms of the distributed ledger layer?
Yes, that's a great question. The reason why I put it here is because it's almost like a service that this platform requires. So the way the open solar architecture works, I'll just put it up here, is it has an integration with Stellar so that it borrows the wallets, the stable coins, fiat on-ramping, bank anchoring. It has another module that integrates data from IoT devices and databases with IPFS integration. Now this is for, in investment automation. So it has OpenX is the bare bones of investors, recipients, and securities. And then Open Solar specifically is for financing solar. So the contract that automates, it's a solar contract. And there's many contracts that one can do for solar. In fact, that's why we frame it as a smart solar library. Pay to own solar is this type of architecture, third-party ownership are all different other contracts. So it's almost like here's an application within a business process flow of financing solar, and it uses Stellar to deal with its payments. But for example, a common data and a common agent would be the investor, or let's say the developer of a project that starts here or here, can be issued a verifiable credential. And when that developer that started the project and that went through the due diligence of a project, originated it, raised the funds, procured, basically hired another developer to build it, and now is operating the project, it's the same agent, the same verifiable credential that with the same DID across all process flows. And so rather than putting it as an underlying, because it's not, for example, Stellar is very specific for payments. You don't need to deal with payments here. You don't need to do payments here. You start dealing with payments here. But when you're bringing capital from investors on a regulated security offering, public offering, the Security Exchange Commission would have a harder time using Stellar for now. And so it's almost like, let's push it down the process flow. It's just almost like an application that sorts out your automation and your power purchase agreement. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
It's very specific to this app rather than the common, business consortium architecture.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I mean, although it is, DLT technology, it's kind of like just a payment gateway, so to speak. And it could be that, it's not necessarily DLT, but it is.
Exactly. In fact, the way that, for example, Raise Green operates with North Capital, it's very traditional banking. And so it's very much like a legacy approach. And the way that we design this is that there's handlers. There's a lot of documentation on this, by the way, if you want to peek through it. And I'll send all the information. I'm happy to send this just because it's a well-documented project. It has a lot of API endpoints on OpenX so that you can create users but there's a lot of work around, rather than using Stellar, using Bitcoin or Ethereum or others, such as Cosmos, Hyperledger, Polkadot. So, it could be something else, but it's very specific to this application. I wanted to ask you, Connor and Sai and Robin, since you've been part of the early conversations, how do you, does this common generic stack make sense? And Robin, I think you worked on the integration of Fabric, and then Connor, the way that you envision this client, if in fact that's part of what you're thinking through, and it relates to the Web3 architecture that you're working on, having more engineering information on how you're thinking through this would be great, because I put it as a conceptual placeholder, but what would be under the hood is something that's beyond my knowledge.
So I think that you know, if we're thinking in terms of the overall architecture that Si's you know, worked on here, you actually kind of have two distributed ledger technologies in there. You've got the Hyperledger Fabric piece, and then you've got the Ethereum piece, or you say Hyperledger Besu. And then each of those kind of has their own clients layer that they use to talk to that, which is, you know, which the actual business application calls out to, so to speak.
Okay, so this could be divided into, you know, at least even having supporting some interoperability between two ledgers, one being Fabric and the other one being ETH via Besu. And the client helps in that. And obviously each application might be, for example, Consensus might have an application for MRV that uses obviously Ethereum Besu. And then the DIDs and the agent credentials, the way that Aries is set out is kind of ledger agnostic. Obviously, it has a lot of easy integration with Fabric because of just the developer community. That would be another set of, you know, you need a ledger to store the DIDs. Okay, and then the client basically helps with bridging these two environments.
Yeah, I think so, right, Connor? That's the idea.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of, so if I was to get into specifics on the Ethereum stuff on our side, you've basically got the, you know, the distributed ledger layer. Then you've got a API which is facilitated by Web3j and Epirus, which is you know, our open source there, but that's kind of, you know, the API that the client kind of you know, exposes, which would be, you know, your token management.
Oh, okay, and that's all within the client. And this is what you're working on, right? The Web3 Labs token management. Does that goes in here as well?
Yeah. I think the probably the simplest way to think of it is like a token API. I mean, the thing is that there's a lot of, you know, you have companies coming up with their own token you know, products and so on, but really what we're doing is we're exposing we're really exposing an Ethereum token on an API rather than trying to have you know, something that's kind of too generic. Because Si mentioned earlier on about, you know, whether there's, you know, common you know, integration sorry, I can't remember if it was Si or someone else, but, you know, if there's common integration libraries for talking to multiple ledgers. And typically when you start going down that path, you start to encounter restrictions in terms of what you can actually achieve on them. So the best known common integration layer is digital assets DAML language. But really what it does is it uses these ledgers as a key value store. And so, you know, by kind of working more with the slightly closer to the metal, so to speak, in terms of these blockchain networks, it enables you to take advantage of the things that they're actually good at. And so, yes, so that's happening here with Fabric, but then also the tokenization piece for Ethereum.
Okay. Yeah, I think that's basically the only thing I could point out is that somewhere we may be using more than one ledger, maybe not, you know, depending on the use case. Like if you're taking data from machines and devices, that could all be transacted there. But if somewhere you are then tokenizing or doing, I guess that's basically what you're doing with the Stellar as well, right? Like you're transacting on another ledger.
Yeah, and
the same.
That's why I thought it was important to divide like a generic architecture and a use case specific architecture, right? Because when you have to go into a use case, you'll find specific taxonomies and and this is, I think, also relevant what you were describing, Connor, at the client level, but also at the protocol level. The work at the Interwork Alliance, right, is to be able to have this token management API, but then defining the token taxonomies, which we would have to see to some extent what Orange Button has that could be used for as a token taxonomy. Otherwise, a rec token is something that one would need in this process flow. And we work with other companies, for example, Switch, that are needed in the process of issuing a remote money certificate.
Yeah, so I think I guess it's two ways to think about it. One is you could think of it as the ledger coming in, and all the data is on your ledger, and then you output it to the Stellar ledger where the payment happens. Or you could think of it as an app that basically is connecting to both a public ledger, which is Stellar, and a private or permission ledger, which is Fabric, at the same time, and coordinating across those two. So, but it seems like, yeah, it's two ways to think about it, and depends on how important one ledger is to the other. Like in Stellar's case, it's just payments, so you could go to another payment ledger without too much. But if it's like regularly recording and then getting emissions tokens off of, say, a public ledger, and then matching it up against your private ledger, then you're kind of integrating the two more core into the app. So yeah, but that's definitely, and I think the level of the agents and BIDs is a good idea. It's not something I know too much about at this point. So if we can get some help on that, that would be very helpful. That would be great.
Yeah, I have a high level understanding, but that's also why I wanted to have a chat with Stephen and maybe, maybe find a way of if we want to use this kind of architecture as a proposal, as a prompt to work together in the collabathon. It's great because I could say, Stephen, can you let know the community of Aries and Indy, Trustor IP, to join us, and then maybe part of the effort is mapping out, and the idea of the collabathon is basically it's a 2-week sprint. We try to, if we don't have to put any code from here to then, but if we have clarity of what we want to build and what needs to be done, then basically everyone, for 2 weeks at least kicks off, the project, because everyone's more attentive to the discussions, and maybe different groups work different pieces of the common puzzle.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a good idea. I like this idea. I think we should go with it if anybody else has any thoughts. But
yes. At which layer do you see the client identity management? If we use SSI like an Indie network, is it what's included in the client SDK, or does every enterprise or user have its own wallet and the wallet directly communicates with the SSI network? Because I don't see identity management in this architectural overview. And if we start dealing with different ledgers and we have credentials, it's definitely one of the core elements.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
this whole part.
I can't go on the details of that, so I'm thinking maybe, I don't know, Connor, if you've dove a little bit deeper into the Indian Aries stack to see if, since you're thinking more on these common clients, how would you interface with Indian Aries? And perhaps that would be a good conversation to have with Stephen. The way I see it is, I mean, that there is a bit of, that India acts as a bit of an identity manager, and that the credentials help to have certain data exchange management. There's this primer, I think it's useful. I don't know if I'm just posting it here. In fact, when I was looking at the way that the Trustor IP stack is described, and this is what I put online. You can find on the site. A lot of this work comes from British Columbia, where they really, this is like GovTech grade, and I find it useful how they make the analogy with credit cards. In fact, I think, yeah, this is the financial service case. MasterCard, issues the card. The bank, well, actually, the bank issues the card, but based on the governance of MasterCard agreement, and then the merchant is the verifier. So I'm just going to jump through one key diagram that shows the stack. Is that there's a public utility area where you have the DID methods and the utilities. For example, who's the transaction officer, who's endorses the transaction, and stewards. And then the DID is also the peer-to-peer protocol. And then the verifiable credential is the data exchange protocol. Like a verifier that verifies a holder, what can they receive information as proof, and this is where zero knowledge proof comes in, and take data from that credential. And this is relevant to the way that we draw it here, because an application may need information about a common agent that was created in this process flow. And so this app maybe used the common credentials, say, I'm going to connect to the credential issuer, and now the user has that credential, and then this app kicks in and says, I need information of that user. And so it pulls it off directly from here based on the permissions they have. And then finally, it's literally the application system sits on top of it. So I have a feeling this is going to be very similar to how this whole community is thinking about it. And perhaps that's worth next step to answer sort of your question, Robin, around like how does this work under the hood, and there might be a lot of things that we could borrow from their work, and I think better yet, getting a common working group with them.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, I definitely think we should get them involved. Yeah.
Martin, do you know of any Hyperledger project which is integrating areas in indies with Hyperledger Fabric?
Yes, I know that there are several, because often within the Indian areas community, anyone that's trying to work on something, they normally come in from the Fabric world. And so that's what they know. And so their first integration is like, okay, I'm going to use this, and then a common data layer where I'm going to post things is going to be Fabric. So I actually think that there's probably a lot of code out there that could be used for that. Exactly which ones? This is where my chat with Stephen on Thursday is almost like, how do we navigate interfacing more with that community? And perhaps it makes sense that for the week after, we organize a meeting with them, and say if, like, who from that community, like the Sovereign Foundation is really the one that's spearheading, Hyperledger Indy. I've talked with them on the last Hyperledger forum. They might want to, we nudge them to join the Collabothon and join our sprint. And then I think we can get a lot done in 2 weeks to flesh it out. And then at least we have a roadmap for next year.
Okay.
Just on that, in terms of in Indian areas, I certainly haven't really delved into them in any depth. I think how I'd kind of been suggesting the kind of key management and identity piece to Sai initially anyway was just to do something very simple until we've got an end-to-end proof of concept working, and then iterate on top of that. Just so that we can have something that kind of proves that initial workflow, and then kind of phase it so that then, okay, going to get that working, and then the next piece is actually they pull in some other people. Because the only I guess I'm slightly hesitant in terms of trying to do too much too early on. And absolutely it makes sense to be further across exactly how they the specifics of working with them, but I also think we should try and get this initial thing working, and then once it's there, then you can start kind of expanding the conversations about the next steps and so on. And it's kind of you know, the driving behind my thinking there is really twofold. Of course, so that we can ensure that SAI has the end-to-end demo, but then also that, you know, with proof of concepts, a lot of the time, especially when we're looking at the sort of more enterprise space, it's more about kind of showing something that kind of works without getting too far into the security considerations, because it's, you know, it's dummy data, it's a prototype, and so on and so forth. Because when we start wanting to get to that sort of more production grade and do, you know, much more significant thing with the credentials, it's, you know, the engineering effort and the time effort and so on becomes a lot greater.
Yeah. Yeah, I think, yeah, I like to learn more about what they do just so we can plan this out longer term, and that's probably where we want to go. But yeah,
sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it.
No, I think, Connor, what you mentioned is it's a very wise approach. In fact, we're doing another proof of concept with our organization called the Spatial Web Foundation, which also is in the Web3 space, and it's on also climate asset management. This is something that we want to put out in the public domain hopefully the next month. We can use that demo, but it borrows from Indian Aries. But at the current stage of the development, what our devs did there is they just kept the handlers to eventually plug that layer in, but it's not plugged in. Mm-hmm. And right now it just uses, I think, like CouchDB as like storing things in there, but they're stored in the format that eventually you can bring in that integration. And if we think of it that way, that would be a great way to interface with the Trust over IP community, because we come up with, you know, a business project process flow logic. We think about the integration with Fabric, which Robin's been working on. We focus a bit on your work, Connor, on that common client. Sai, you know a lot about the electricity, you know, utility API and Orange Button, which I think is a huge asset that we have. We have a couple of applications to play with to show POCs. Matt described his originator engine and how he operates in the portal. We have the whole Open Solar project. And then basically, as long as we have the right, you know, kind of handlers towards an identity management layer, this is where we put the challenge up for the, let's say someone in the Trust over IP Foundation, say, look at what we're working on and bring in your piece to the puzzle. Mm-hmm. That would I think would be a good way of framing it.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe this could be something they could demonstrate to us how they would do it and integrate, if that's something that they're interested in enough in. And if we have people who are interested in what we're doing, it'd be a good demo for them. So
have you been in contact with the ID working group with Vipin?
Vipin is very active, and he comes to the sessions every now and then. I think having him also join would be great, because he's such a mover and shaker in the Hyperledger community. And particularly if we think about this use case of solar financing, which is from climate action, the heart of it, you know, like over the next 30 years, we're going to have to move trillions of dollars into decentralized solar infrastructure. And it's a very, very well established, you know, business area. It's a very well established kind of like technology. It interfaces with the payment architecture. It can interface with climate bonds, which is something that Vipin is interesting in. It interfaces with RECs, you know, and carbon offsets. So I think it's we just take that business process flow, it can plug into a lot of things within the Hyperledger world, and it would plug in directly with the Linux Climate Finance Foundation. In fact, just going to share my screen real quick. Just to talk a bit about the Collaborathon format, because I've invited Truman Siemens, who's the head of the OS Climate, to one of the talks. So this is when you land to the Collaborathon, the landing page just describes the general event, but the Open Climate Dialogues, which kick off the first 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, 2 sessions each day, it starts with broader climate accounting and the context of Paris. It then follows with how to scale open source collaboration. And then it goes into emission accounting. And then it's this working group that I think that this would be, we originally thought about this because it had consumer disclosure. And then the final dialogue is finance. So every dialogue lasts for 60 minutes and it's got a couple of speakers, and then it's got a 60-minute slot for working groups to provide an onboarding session where we describe what the working group is doing. So check this out. This is the first session, has a couple of speakers. Then we move into scaling open source. Noah will be moderating this from the side of CodeMakery. We invited Scott to talk about Gitcoin. Bonnie Wolf, who leads Code for America and Hack for LA. Adorn, that manages a very use case specific open source community on agriculture. And actually we invited Brian Bellendorf, also from Hyperledger. He hasn't answered yet, but I hope we're keeping the slot for him to talk in this panel. And then, so that it segues into a working group where the participants that join the session are invited to, okay, if you were inspired by the dialogue, now we can put in actions on words. And then the morning of November 10th, emissions accounting, supply chain, consumer disclosure, differentiated commodities. We have Felipe, who joins in from the World Economic Forum. He's working on, for example, if you have to differentiate palm oil from a high impact like Borneo source or a more sustainable source, how does that fit into the markets? Jason does differentiate commodities from the energy space. He found it expensive back in the day. And the group works a lot on token and markets and opening markets. So this is where we had originally slotted this working group, that right after we come in and we say, okay, well, one thing that we're working on is, originally was this diagram and pointing towards everything that's happening here. And then using this session, these 60 minutes, to onboard participants that join the session. They may be experts on different areas, and we invite them to join in. So we give an overview of what the working group is doing, what the efforts are, and then the session continues that afternoon. We have land-based ecosystem service credits. Diego from Britannia works on machine learning and satellite. Kate that works more on the interface with UN. Gregory with Cosmos application of ecosystem service credits. They are actually hosting the other working group with the open team. And then the final day is technology and standards. We have Owen Hewlett from the Gold Standard group. He's the CTO. We've invited CBL Markets and Expansive to talk also about Interwork Alliance on technology and standards, and the World Bank. So we have the World Bank Climate Warehouse joining this. And then this is what I wanted to say, is like the climate finance. Then we have Truman from OS Climate and Linux Climate Finance Foundation. So we've got some really exciting events coming up, and they're all designed to recruit people into the working groups to get stuff done, because the rest of the week, particularly, for example, that Saturday, we do lightning talks to, again, onboard developers into working groups and teams. And so you can register. So this is something we should definitely sign up to give a lightning talk again, because this is better, more clear here. First 3 days are of November 9th to 11th are the dialogues and the working group onboarding. The Saturday, which is normally when a lot of the hacking community really plugs in, they want to join on Saturday and say, okay, what's happening in the community? What are the exciting projects? Okay, I'm a backend developer expert on this stack. I can plug in, I can do some of the tasks. So if we actually come up with a clear architecture and we have some ideas of tasks, we can put it out. We can create issues on a GitHub and recruit people to work on that. And then the second week is basically the same. It's just a continuation. If we want to do a specific meeting, like a peer programming meeting, we can sign up as a community event. So this is a good opportunity to put this into a stage, and that's why I thought it made sense 2 weeks ahead that we start thinking about this the lead up to it.
Okay.
And the same thing for you, Alfonso. You know, if you have a very clear idea on MRV, you could create a community event, or we basically try to find ways of coalescing working groups. It really depends on what's the use case that you're thinking, what's the stack that you want to operate in, et cetera.
It's a use case, but also what you're saying is very important. It's building up this community.
Yeah.
Okay? It's getting people involved. And that's why I gave that presentation that Sai came to. It was pompously called, we in Latin America tend to be so, a master class. It wasn't a master class. It was just a general introduction. Okay? General introduction to get people engaged and interested. In some countries, there's been some work done, like in Chile, you know, but in Mexico, we're going the opposite way now. So we have to fight for it. So it's, yes, we have a project that we presented to UK Pact, but we also want to support, Martin, what you are presenting. Building a community for this issue is extremely important.
Yeah, and part of what this tries to do is a community of communities, because if we think about working groups, you know, there's different working groups in the Hyperledger space. There's working groups now kicking off from the Earth to Work Alliance. There's working groups in the Climate Change Coalition that we're trying to invite as well. And a lot of them can be doing a lot of overlapping efforts, and they know of each other, but they, you know, ideally the Cloud Fund's a 2-week moment in the year in the lead up to the climate negotiations where we agree as a global community to talk to each other and say, oh, you're doing that, we're doing this. And so it's a bit of cross-pollination between working groups. That's why I asked Cameron Prowl to see if he can host the Technology and Standards Working Group.
And something that's just occurring to me, maybe you already thought about it, okay. Why don't you speak with, and I can connect, with David Boswell, who's in charge of all the meetups. So because there are 170, 180 worldwide meetups, okay. So I think this project, it's the exact kind of project that David would be very interested in promoting at 170 places all over the world.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think I'll send an email to David, to Brian, to Marta on the Hyperledger world to see like how can we best leverage a lot of this opportunity to get a lot of groups.
And also to Bobby Muscara.
Uh-huh.
I am with Bobby in Learning Materials and Development Group. And Bobby is also a shaker as VP. Bobby has just been, she has just been elected to the Technical Steering Committee. Okay. And Bobby has a good relationship with Brian.
Great, yes.
And Marta definitely is David, Bowie, Bonnie, Marta. Those are good channels for all the meetups, but also for Brian.
Yes, yes. Should I send an email to all of them?
Go by one. There are big egos there.
Okay. Yeah, I will send an email directly to David, Brian, and Marta, which is the same team.
Yeah. Okay.
Does that make sense? And then separate Bobby and separate to Vipin. Yeah.
Yes.
Connor, how do you also see this interfacing with some of the other communities that you're involved with? I think that there's probably like, you know, in the Ethereum space, there's a couple of working groups and Web3 space, Interwork Alliance.
So, I mean, they're definitely at the moment, the nearest one is definitely the Interwork Alliance, just because you know, we're actively starting to come up with the kind of patterns for design for smart contracts to support these business processes. But then we're working closely with the TTF as well on the, you know, the properties. And so one of the examples that we're kind of trying to flesh out in the IWA at the moment is like the MRV process in terms of the verification piece, when you've got like a standards body verifying the measurements and then actually minting some sort of offset token. And so that's like a use case that we're looking at the moment. And so, you know, it's very much so my want that that we'll be able to well, that we'll be able to, you know, have some of these kind of standard grammars being defined within the IWA to support all of this. Now, the only thing is that not everything's out in the public domain just yet. And so obviously I want to make sure though that we're not in a position where like there's stuff happening there, but then we're not able to, you know, bring it up with everything that's happening on this call, say, because you know, it just completely makes sense to be trying to share as much of this information as possible. Let me, one thing I mean, I believe there's a affiliate membership, so maybe I should actually ask the question about you know, this working group and sharing information between IWA anyway, but definitely.
Well, Hyperledger is a member of the IWA, so that's and the Open Earth Foundation on my end as well. We're members of that.
Yeah.
But I mean, I did talk to Cameron on about this and invited him to also speak. And you know, they're eager to find cross-pollination, like working with cross-pollination. But indeed, it really depends on which stage they're in, and at least it makes sense for. If we think that we have a clear architecture, first use case, we know all the pieces that can come together, that we can put that narrative forward, and it helps everyone kind of plug in from their different angles.
Yeah, and I can definitely help with kind of providing the right grammar, I guess, for how to, you know, how we're describing that in the Interwork Alliance and mapping it to the frameworks there, so that we can ensure, you know, a good example is that you know, the tokens that are being created here, and making sure that they can map to the TTF, so that there's some commonality there, and there's gonna be a nice segue into the IWA, because I certainly think that there's a lot, you know, there should be, given how long that this group's been running for as well, there's a lot of, you know, good knowledge that should be passed on almost to the IWA in terms of getting them off the ground. And also with my role there as well, you know, I'm keen to kind of spearhead some of the sustainability focused you know, processes rather than the, you know, some of the other ones there. With respect to the Enterprise Ethereum Alliance, they don't have a sustainability focused working group at the moment, but I don't see any reason, you know, that down the line, it's certainly something that could be highlighted in terms of, you know, some crossover there. But there's, yeah, I think right now just playing into the IWA is going to be the most valuable thing, because there's, you know, if you can kind of rubber stamp some of this there, it's like there's two organizations really collaborating well there.
Yeah, and if we do a proper session, I can invite the folks at Consensus that are working also on MRV, and obviously close to EEA and BESU. One. Well, so there's two things that I wanted to say. I am very much like at the big pictures, broader view. Turning this into technical prompt and software project management is something that I'd love to work with all of you, some of you, into saying, okay, this is a good vision. How do we turn this into a public, you know, open source project that has its own project management and issues, etc. And if we do that after the Collaborathon, one of the ideas that I wanted to test after, it's been quite some time that I've wanted to do this, is try open bounty mechanisms where you say, okay, we use a common open infrastructure we want to build and part of the digital public good, and we can interface with Gitcoin and Komakery to put funds out there that developers could pick up tasks, build, and cash on in some sense. I'm very interested in, and I've had discussions with this with Brian Bellendorf. He often says, as soon as you bring in extrinsic motivation into open source development, the quality sometimes can go down. But I think this is a very interesting future of work, a dialogue, and also scaling open source where, developers that are working on a common infrastructure either have an incentive because their application and their company needs or can benefit from that common infrastructure. But you might have other ones that are, great and they're interested in that, but they do have to cover some of the time. And I'm willing to put in $10,000 at least on funds to down the line to say, let's test how much we can get done from a broader developer community. We write down all the tasks and the funds. And I mentioned that, and Matt said, we can match that as well, if we want to do a specific sort of like use case for the solar. And then I know that Comakery obviously has a whole platform where you can onboard crypto in and integrate with Gitcoin. And then as soon as you finish a task, someone that's a software project manager reviews what was done, looks at the code and says, yes, this is the code that we were after, boom, and then submits a payment. We don't have to put all of this at the same time, but I just want to put it as a placeholder, as something that I'd love to tinker with. Not in the context of the collaborathon. I think the collaborathon, the 2 weeks, have to be purely, intrinsic motivation of people working together, and that's their motivation. But it can kick off a project that then can leverage some of these, software developer engagement mechanisms.
Well, that's a big topic. I think we'll need a full session just for that one,
Yes.
But it's,
well, actually, there is a whole session. So session number 2 in the dialogues.
Yeah.
We'll talk a little bit about that.
That would be very, very interesting to talk about some of this. Well, thank you, Martin. So I just actually, since you're all here, I want to show you where we are real quick and also get your advice on a couple of things in terms of deployment. So let me share my screen with you. What is this? Share. It's got all these. How do you share the screen again? This is really strange.
In the bottom, there should be a green button that says share screen.
Oh, yes. The most obvious one. Okay. So, yeah, let's see. Docker Compose. Okay, so I've got, using Robin's Docker Compose, I've got the network up and running with 3 nodes. And I've got the chain code deployed as well. We've updated the chain code a little bit to use the user registration. So if we come here, and then we've implemented this. So you can now put in auditor, enroll. Whoops, I always do this. Okay, this is because I did not actually start the API, which I can fix.
Oh, and it already links with some of the work from
yeah. Yeah, so now we've got this going. So, okay, so we can enroll an organization, and then this just successfully enrolled the Auditor 1 organization, which is one of the organizations. And then, okay, so now it says all these users are currently enrolled. Because we store the user enrollment. Let me show you. This is, where did that go?
And if you store it on a simple database on your backend, eventually that's what can be replaced with the agent and DID framework.
Yeah, that's what I guess that's what I like to just understand. But right now, so we're just storing it here. So in PostgreSQL, in the Django database, these are all the users. And then we are storing their organization. So actually, I should delete them because update. Because we have, in fact, not stored them. I've cleared out, so I'll need to update it and set the org name to null for all these guys. Oh, I guess, no, it's not gonna let me do that. Okay, so I'll have to see, let's see, could I do this? Okay, so then back. If you come back to it again, it already know that it's enrolled. So then let's say that we want to enroll the admin user into department 1. So then it's enrolled the admin user into department 1 successfully. And then if we go to one of our sites, okay. So then we can say record emissions data. Okay. It's probably because it doesn't have emissions data for that period yet. Oh, doesn't like that. Okay. Okay, sorry, it's not, yeah, somehow the wallet and the identity. Okay, well, you have to take my word that this worked Friday, but right now it's not working. So, but fast forward a little bit, what I was able to do is both record and get the emissions back with the user and the wallet. So I guess what I want to do is talk a little bit about how we could deploy this to production and get your ideas on how we do this. Because I feel like in developing these things, until we've deployed it in production, there's just a lot of things that are still not clear. So even a simple deployment will really help in terms of what we're trying to do. So yeah, you know, I guess if you guys could give me your suggestions. Connor, I know you have mentioned this blockchain as a service, right? Where on Azure, we could have Kubernetes cluster, and then they could set up basically 3 separate nodes for us, and then we could deploy the nodes to Azure, right? But I guess on and maybe that's good to try out, I think, initially, but what I'm trying to think about is how would we do this just to really understand how to deploy it so that at some point we could have a series of nodes, you know, and it could be, for example, different companies like your company in the UK, us here in LA, Robin in Berlin, and Antonio in Mexico. We could all each be a node on this network. So we could be passing in utility bills for each of the customers on these nodes, and then recording all the data together on the ledger. So like, for example, would we want to set up a image for a node that has a peer and a CouchDB and a certificate authority? And then would there be a central registry, or is that where the order, basically we would configure the orders and it would talk to, it would know where the peers are and the nodes are, I guess, or how, I'm guessing that's probably how it would work, but I'd like to know what you guys think in terms of how we could do this.
I mean, generally speaking, from experience, the different organizations and different individuals, they've all got their own kind of preference for, you know, how these well, how the network should be governed is one part of it, in terms of, you know, in the case of Fabric, you know, which organization should be allowed to run orderer nodes versus, you know, only have peers. Because, you know, if you've got a large organization versus a small organization, the large organization isn't necessarily going to want, you know, a small organization with equal weighting on the network.
Mm-hmm.
But then there's also though the actual, the how they run the nodes, whether they're using Kubernetes clusters in house, or whether they're running virtual servers, or even they've got their own infrastructure. It's every organization and individual, there's going to be a lot of different preferences there, and so where that in itself can be quite a long-winded process, because one approach is that you have these kind of ready-made. You could have ready-made containers, but that might not be, not everyone may be happy with that. But by the same token, I would say that in order to just get it kind of out there, I'd say just choose what is likely to be the most straightforward option, and then just basically say this is how we need to do it for now, because we want to get this live and running, rather than lose time playing around with deployments, because the whole blockchain deployment thing is very tricky, and that's why there's companies that do it, because of how much time it takes. So I'd just think in terms of do something simple, or even use a platform just to say, we've got these different nodes and they're kind of simulating this environment, just so that you don't have to go down that whole path of working, getting it perfect for each organization.
Yeah, we can start just by getting familiar with it. I mean, I think that maybe this kind of an Azure blockchain as a service that you talked about would be a good way to at least learn how to do it once. But otherwise, I think, but somewhere along the line, I want this to be like a real production or semi-production thing, so we'd want an order. Okay, so I guess somebody like we'll set up a node, let's say, and say that's going to be our order, and then there will be peers which can run on anything, right? As long as they communicate with us. Like, for example, you might want to run your peer node on Azure. Robin could have a data center virtual server that he could use, and Antonio and I could each come up with something else. But as long as we all use the same Hyperledger fabric image, it's okay, right? Or some kind of a Docker or a Kubernetes container. Is that the goal? So basically it's configuring is it to configure the order to run all the different nodes? Is that how this would work? Or to talk to all the nodes on the network?
We need to configure the config
TXT
YAML file, which includes the basic information about the network. For example, the IP address of the nodes and the ports. And with this configuration file, you can build the Genesis block.
Okay.
You need to distribute to all the nodes they need it in order to start, and then start a discovery service. So we need to agree on this file. We need all the information of the different nodes.
Okay.
So you also put in all the policies and the governance of the network.
Okay. And so would this be deployed with the order or with is that how this would work? Is there a guide on how to do this?
You can have a look at the Hyperledger Fabric documentation, but that's what you pay for if you use the services.
Yeah, of course.
Easy.
Well, if we were to use the service, and I'm not opposed to using the service, could we add more nodes that are not in the service? Like, for example, I'm fine to use this, but if you want to join and you have your own server, or you want to use AWS, I don't want to say, well, no, you have to work with Microsoft, right?
I'm not sure if this is going to work, because I think Microsoft Azure is running on Hyperledger Fabric version 1.4.x, and for example, IBM is on 2.2 or 2.0. So they have to be the same version of Hyperledger Fabric. And sometimes they use, they kind of added the code, the binaries, so that they can use it to run in their environments. It's not but I'm not sure if it's gonna work.
I see. Okay. Okay. I see. Okay.
I have to jump in a meeting. Sorry to interrupt. I think this is great because we're kind of going into the weeds, and it fits, I understand, very well with everything we described before. Just wanted to put out there my comment that I'd love to help in translating this into like a technical prompt. Think of it a software project management kind of path.
Okay.
So maybe we can coordinate. I could do a follow-up meeting to ground a lot of what we discussed into a plan.
Okay.
It's easier to convey it in 2 weeks from now. We have a little bit of time, but I think that day, November 10th, could be a good day to, let's say, kick off and say, here's what we're working on. And in the meantime, I'll start building, interest from the community, reaching out to more of the Hyperledger folks, saying, hey, we want to put this out.
Okay. Great. Well, thank you, Martin. This is really great. Thank you for all your everything.
Well, I'm glad that helps it make sense. I think that we're coalescing into a common vision and architecture. So I think that's where things really make a lot of sense.
Okay.
Happy to follow up on an email to coordinate follow-ups to this and work on a project plan.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
All right. Have a good one. Cheers. Bye-bye.
Okay.
Bye.
So, okay, I see but I guess, do you guys have a few more minutes? Or do you have a few more minutes, Robin? I know Connor had to leave as well, but yeah. So, okay, so basically it's the config TX. This is basically what we need to configure and then deploy on the order, right? Is that right? And all the...
We have also this file in the OpenTabs repository. It's Docker Compose setup. That's the one we currently use. And
okay.
you can have a look at the, what is it called? Network.sh script. And there are all the steps we need to follow in order to start a production-ready network.
Okay. So, okay. So that's basically, each one has its own Docker container, right? And so we could, like, for example, put a Docker image on 3 separate AWS like instances, right? Instead of, okay. And then, so one Docker image per instance, and then those could then form the network, right?
I'm not sure if we can just use the AWS instance, because if you have one image which includes 3 different containers. So for the container orchestration, I think we need something like Kubernetes or OpenShift, which is based on Kubernetes.
Okay.
So it's more to have at least 2 different instances for the order and the peer node.
Okay.
I can do some research on this. What's the easiest way for us and also the cheapest one?
Yeah, just to...
we don't have to pay a plan which is like $2,000 a month. So maybe $20 per AWS instance.
Yeah, just something simple, just to prove that we could deploy it and what's involved in deploying it. And then I think we can have some idea of how to work on this from here. And then what about the security key? Would we need to create the security keys and upload it, or how would the security certificate authority work in terms of...
Yes. So every organization would have its own certificate authority.
Okay.
So let's say I'm gonna run the European node. So I would run the peer node, one ordering node, and one certificate authority. And I have to generate all the crypto material I need in order to run my order and peer nodes by myself.
Mm-hmm.
So I have the admin credentials for my certificate authority.
Right. Okay, so you would still generate certificates for all the users on your node?
Yes.
Okay. So generate certificates. Okay.
That's a step you do when you enroll auditor org one.
Mm-hmm.
That's when you enroll your admin, and then you can enroll all the users with the auditor one CA.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. That's what I was trying to show you earlier, but it was a little bit of a hike. Okay, I understand now. So yeah, I guess that's. I like to do some research on this, and then work on getting it basically deployed, even temporarily as a test network. Whatever images, so we know what we're building towards, and then.
Yes.
Yeah, and then I think that's like we're doing some enhancements as well. I think you didn't meet Mike last week, but he's been working with me on this. He's one of our new developers, so we're going to get this to more of actually a working program for recording emissions data from utility bills, and I think that'll then tie into a lot of other things. So. Okay. Well, do you have anything else you want to talk about? We're kind of late now.
I need to do some research on how we can integrate areas in Indy to Hyperledger Fabric.
Okay.
And how we can start the deployment in the cloud environment.
Okay.
And
yeah.
This will lead to some tasks for the collaborathon, hopefully.
Yeah, I think so too. I like just as simple as deployment, but just to prove that it could be deployed, would be great. So, okay, I think Alfonso has to go.
Just 2 organizations, for example.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it's easier for us.
Yeah, like for example, it could be your node in Europe, my node here, and then
yes.
And then we figure out how to add more nodes. Actually, that would be really helpful, So then.
Yes. And it's getting very interesting. That's not easy.
Okay.
But it's fun. We should do. That's what we have to do either way. So.
Okay. Yeah, I think so. Otherwise, yeah. So, well, let's talk more then. And thank you, Alfonso. Nice to meet you.
Bye-bye, guys. Great being with you. Bye-bye.
Yeah. So great. Then we'll just communicate as this goes along.
Okay. Great.
Okay. Thank you. Have a good week.
Have a good week. Bye.
Bye-bye.